Good morning, or depending when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so I've made a podcast all about the Pokémon trading card game. And you're listening to PTCG Radio on what is a very exciting week indeed. Now, due to Yodel being, I think incompetent as a delivery company would not be an understatement. They are a delivery company that struggle to deliver stuff, and when they deliver it turns up broken. Now, of course, this is purely anecdotal, etc., not telling you what to do, merely relaying stories, don't want to get sued and all of that. But from my experience, Yodel are a delivery company unable to deliver. Partly, I just wanted to tell you that, because if you're in the UK, don't use Yodel. It's kind of like starting with a sponsor this week. Except instead of it's me being paid by someone to tell you to use a particular product, I am in fact not being paid, but telling you not to use a particular company. But there is a reason to this story, other than Yodel are terrible, do not use them. And the point of the story is that if I wasn't desperately trying to rush around for Yodel, trying to find out why my parcel turned up looking like it had been jumped on, I'm not exaggerating, check me on Twitter at @TheWassy for exciting pictures, I would have recorded this podcast at about 7 p.m. As it is, I'm sitting down at about 20 past 8 in the evening to start my recording, and it has just been announced that the rotation is going to be XY on next year. Or, if you want to be a total pedant, and I am a fan of pedantry, ladies and gentlemen, it is actually XY Trainer Kit on. And that does make a difference because Crushing Hammer has most recently been reprinted in the XY Trainer Kit. So were it not for the XY Trainer Kit, we would have lost Crushing Hammer. So if anyone's thinking, oh, it doesn't really matter about the Trainer Kit, oh yes it does. It has kept a very relevant and important card, which will see play next year, I would imagine at least. It has kept it in the format, so that's kind of interesting. So, what we were going to do today, we're going to have a look at Giant Plant Forest. It's an episode I've been threatening to do for weeks now, basically going through going through every set that's going to be legal next year, and essentially looking at any grass Pokemon which are going to be more playable with the advent of this stadium. It's a stadium that allows you to evolve grass Pokemon as and when you like. Now, I wrote up some notes today and I was all ready for that, and then the rotation's gone. So what we are going to do, ladies and gentlemen, I have started this podcast a little bit later than planned, partly because Yodel are completely inept and rude, but also partly because I've been going through the 5 sets that we're losing, and I've had a look at the major cards. Now, this is very much a first look, and I'll get into all the disclaimers about this later. So we're going to have a look at that, and if we've got time, we're going to have a look at the cards which are best used with Giant Plant Forest. If we haven't got time, then we will get onto that next week. We'll see how it goes. I don't know as I'm recording this, but if you have a look at the description, either on YouTube or SoundCloud or wherever you're listening to this, if I've had time, I will say in the description, and if I don't say in the description, then I clearly haven't had time to do it. But first, a couple little bits of news, and there isn't too much in the way of news. Now, there have been some cards revealed, but they're all pretty terrible. We've seen some cards from the Emboar EX versus Togekiss EX deck. This is one that I've told you about recently, which is going to be having Emboar and Togekiss EX, both of which are mildly intriguing, but not particularly good. I believe it was last week's podcast I went through them, so check back if you want to listen through to that. Now, in terms of the actual cards that have been revealed, honestly, I'd be just as well telling you what Pokemon are there. There's an Electabuzz, there's an Electivire, there's a Corsola, an Esper, a Meowstic, and a Morile, and they're all terrible. Now, I mean, the best one of the bunch, and this is really in inverted commas here, actually I will point out the set symbol on these cards is beautiful. Now, the last trainer kit I actually bought, or thing of this nature, I bought the, I think it was a black and white one. If I remember correctly, it was Zoroark, and it was Excadrill, because I love Excadrill, and there was a really cool holo which could only be gotten in the trainer kit. And the set symbols, 30 of the cards had the Excadrill as a set symbol, and the other 30 cards had Zoroark as a set symbol. And you see this thing here, they've got an Emboar as a set symbol, which is really quite cool, or indeed a Togekiss as a set symbol, so that's really cool. The Morile, for a colourless energy, it does 10 damage. 15 damage would be very weird at this stage. And you flip a coin if head, they're paralysed. There's a Meowstic, which is a stage 1 90 HP psychic type, that for 1 colourless energy allows you to choose 2 energy cards from your hand and attach them to one of your bench Pokemon. But considering Xerneas attaches from the deck and is a basic, it's just infinitely better. Corsola does 30 damage times the number of heads you can flip from 2 coins for a double colourless. Electivire does 30 for a double colourless or 90 for a double colourless and a lightning. They're not good. Speaking of not good, I've been telling you a little bit about the legendary Holo collection. And this is kind of, I suppose, take 3, if you will. No, take 4, actually. I do apologise. We had Dragon Vault, the Shiny Dragon Collection. We had, Shiny Collection in Japan, Radiant Collection in the US and Europe, which was added into the reprint set Legendary Treasures as Radiant Collection. And we had the recently released Double Crisis, the Aqua and Magma set. And this is going to be a new thing along those lines. Loads of legendary Pokemon in holos and all stuff like that. Now, the good news is that it's going to be released in Japan on Saturday, so next week I should be able to give you a full rundown of the set, although honestly I think it's going to be pretty quick. Now, we've seen the Latios and the Latias, and this set really is going to come down to, are you a collector or are you a player? If you're a collector, you are in luck, ladies and gentlemen. These cards are beautiful. They are full art cards with the art taking up the whole of the card, not going over the edges at all, like we've seen from some of the EX cards, but still full art cards. When I say full art, I don't mean full art in the way that we expect full art cards with a funky kind of pattern and design and printing. What I mean is the art takes up the whole card. And the Latios is flying away from a Palkia, and the Latias is flying along with I think it's a Noibat and a Bravery. I might have got the name slightly wrong. Down a little, kind of away from some mountains. The art looks utterly beautiful. The cards are garbage. Latias draws a card for 1 energy, and if you've got Latios on the bench, you can draw a second card, which, I mean, that's just not good. That's a very even in the kind of realm of other similar Pokemon, it's just not very good at all. I mean, if you want an equivalent attack, the Deoxys from Roaring Skies is also a basic, but for a colourless energy, not a fire energy, it draws 2 cards rather than drawing 1, 2 if Latios is on the bench. So it's colourless energy, not specific. It always draws 2 cards. It's got more HP. It's got a half-decent attack coming after it. And you can use that attack if you go first on the very first turn of the game. So there is literally no reason to play Latias, just play the Deoxys from Roaring Skies. Oh, unless you're really worried about the psychic weakness. The Deoxys from Roaring Skies. Latios does 20 damage for 1 colourless energy, and it does 70 damage, 120 if Latias is on your bench, for a water psychic double colourless. That is overpriced to the extreme. Now, what I should point out is that both of these Pokemon are Dragon Pokemon, so you can use double Dragon Energy to bring down the attack cost. Even bearing that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, it's still massively, massively overpriced. And I don't want to say garbage, but basically garbage. I'm sorry if that seems rude and disrespectful, but I think this legendary holo collection that they're releasing in Japan on Saturday, I really don't think it's designed to be for players. It is pretty as you like. So if you're going to collect the set and stick it in a binder, ladies and gentlemen, this is for you. However, if you're a serious player interested in playable cards, I would skip this set entirely. It ain't no good. Sorry about that. Now, I was going to have a quick chat about the 2 possible rotations, but yeah, it's not happening. For anyone interested, the reason why we might have seen a Legendary Treasures on rotation was firstly to rotate all of the kind of like the plasma block, all the plasma sets and the A-specs, etc. And a second reason is that Pokemon have made it clear in the past that they want to rotate 4 sets. And last year, everybody thought it was going to be Plasma Storm on. It turned out to be Boundaries Crossed on. So there were reasons why Legendary Treasures on would have made sense. Obviously, that's not happened. The main reason for going X and Y on is because it's the X and Y block. You get rid of all the old style cars and it's just X and Y onwards. Because we see new designs and stuff when we see a new block come out. So it does make perfect sense in that respect. And before we move on, I just want to give a little tiny bit of, I suppose, advice really about Worlds drafts. Now, I'm a big fan of these, just so we're clear. I think I took part in a US Nationals draft I joined in on last year. I did terribly. My team really let me down. But I made a point of drafting people like Daniel Altavia and Alex Hill, who I know listen to the podcast. So even though I didn't win, I wasn't even close. Even though I didn't win the Nationals draft I took part in last year, I at least made sure that I drafted PTCG radio listeners. And I won the moral victory, so to say. Now, I was looking at a couple of these recently, and what struck me was the UK players. Now, just so we're clear, I am not criticising anybody's Worlds draft. I'm not involved in your draft. You can draft whoever you like. And more importantly, it's very, very difficult to know about UK players. I could sit here, and if any of you want to hit me up for advice for UK players for any Worlds draft, please feel free. You can email me at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk, or you can find me on Twitter @TheWassy. But I don't have an in-depth knowledge of French and German players. Now, I can tell you a few, but mostly from reputation. So I don't expect people to know about UK players. Now, I won't name the chap, but everybody knows who if you know him, you know who I'm talking about. If you don't know him, it makes no difference if I name him or not. But there's a UK player who's been disqualified, let's say, multiple times this season, and was disqualified from the UK National Championship for cheating. That's not hearsay. I have spoken to several people, including unnamed judges who were at the tournament, and I can tell you, this isn't hearsay, for a fact, he got disqualified because he was being given hand signals by a friend. Amongst other things. There were other allegations which were unproven. Like, for instance, there was an allegation that he kept hold of a trainer after a gets this, when you're supposed to shuffle all your trainers in your hand back into your deck. So, that's just an allegation. But I know he got disqualified from Nationals for cheating. He's also played at Worlds, I think, twice, and never top cut. He's not gotten a huge reputation as a great player, by which I mean, I think he's top cut Nationals, twice, or something along those lines. He's not had a huge list of really good achievements. He's a very solid player, let me be clear about that. And he's done well at many regional cities. He's qualified for Worlds. I think this is the 3rd year in a row he's qualified for Worlds. He's a decent player, but he's not a great player. But lots and lots of people know him. So he gets drafted. Now, one player that I saw not get drafted in a recent draft is Alex Dow or Tamau Cameron, depending how you think of him. And he won UK Nationals. Now, officially, he came second, but as explained on the National stream, and go back and watch the final from UK Nationals, it's on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/PTCG Radio. I have an interview, I have the game up, and I have an interview with the 2 finalists after the game where they explain, essentially, Alex wins, but then scoops because he had a paid trip from being top 22 in Europe anyway, and his best friend he was playing in the final didn't have a paid trip. By scooping, they both got a paid trip. So, he is currently the 10th ranked player in Europe. He's the UK national champion, And he's already got into the invites on day 2. He's got a day 2 invite as one of the top 22 players in Europe. How he doesn't get drafted, I have absolutely no idea. But then again, he's another player. He doesn't have a huge kind of, list of achievements at Worlds, although he's qualified before. But not a huge amount of people know who he is. So, the advice I'm going to give you is this. There's an awful lot of people like Tom Hall, who incidentally isn't going to Worlds this year. Tom's a very good player. He's top cut Worlds before. He's played at Worlds many, 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 many times. But he hasn't really done much this season. He's top cut a couple of regionals. But he's not in the top few UK players this year. So I wouldn't recommend drafting him terribly high. And if you're listening to this, Tom, I'm terribly sorry. But you're not going to Worlds, so I'm hoping you can forgive me. Whereas there are other UK players I really think you should. So here's my advice. Firstly, look up national champions. National champions have won big tournaments recently in this format, or at least a very similar format, and are good right now. Secondly, with the draft, you want to play the odds here. Now, what Pokemon have done brilliantly now, and I'll just say, go to Pokemon.com and you can look up the rankings. And if you look up the rankings, make sure you sort by championship point, not rating. You need to sort by championship point. So if you search by championship points, they have basically coloured, I think it's in gold, they've coloured all the players with a day 2 invite. Now, if you draft people who have got a day 1 invite, they've got to get to day 2 and then win. If you draft players with a day 2 invite, they are already one step closer to winning. Now, having said that, last year Jason Kaczynski didn't have an invite, grinded through and then won Worlds in the end, so it's far from a foolproof method. But if you don't know players from a particular country, focus on national champions and people that have day 2 invites. That makes perfect sense to me. Now, for my advice for UK players, and any UK players listening, if I don't name you, please don't hate me. You know I love you all. Well, the vast majority of you. But the 2 people you've got to draft are Alex Dow and Ryan Morehouse. Alex is ranked number 10 in Europe and just won nationals. Ryan came, I think, 19th at Worlds last year. And also made top 22 and has a day 2 invite. They should be the first 2 UK players drafted. And yes, I mean ahead of Sami Sakoum. Although, draft Sami Sakoum, because I think he's failed to top cut Worlds once or something stupid. In, forever. So, draft Sami Sakoum. But you also want to be looking at players like Tamau Cameron, who has consistently done well tournament after tournament for several years now. Ollie Fennelly just came second at Nationals and has a very good resume. Carl Blake is a player who tends to do well at Nationals pretty much every year and has had some success at Worlds. Charlie Powell, along with Tamau, top cut Worlds, I believe it was 2 years ago with Kling Klang. They both made top 32. So there's some names to be looking out for. But again, hit me up if you want some more detailed advice. Now, I think that's enough for Worlds draft, but I've seen it's something that a lot of the tournaments, it's something that a lot of the community is starting to take part in at the moment. So I thought it'd be a good idea to give you my 2 cents worth. And if you're invited into a Worlds draft with any of your mates, go for it. And if you're not, have a go. Just go on someone like Burbank City Gym, or again, if you really want a format, you can hit me up. I'm sure I can find you a format. But all you need is a bit of a scoring system and half a dozen friends, and boom, you're in. So, I was going to go through my best uses for Giant Plant Forest, which has been inexplicably renamed Forest of Giant Plants in English, which is basically the same name but more of a mouthful and less intuitive, so cheers, Pokemon. But instead, I want to talk about the rotation. Now, just to be clear, I found out about the rotation about 40 minutes ago. It was only announced like an hour ago. I think I found out about it 15 minutes after it was posted or something stupid. So, I have probably forgotten a couple of cards. There are probably a couple cards that I'm not going to mention. And some of you might be sitting there going, oh, I can't believe he forgot this card. Similarly, there is a chance I might make a small mistake. Maybe one of these cards has been reprinted as a promo, which is being kept in the format which I've forgotten about. If either of those 2 things happen, hit me up on Twitter @TheWassy. I will happily give a correction next week. Most of this information should be totally sound. But just to be completely clear, I can't promise that this is going to be perfect. What I can promise is that I'm going to have a darned good go at giving you the key information that you need. So, let's rock through this, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to go set by set as it's being rotated, and I'm going to tell you about the main cards that have been rotated. So, starting off, in Boundaries Crossed, we lost both Blastoise and Keldeo. Now, Blastoise did actually get reprinted twice. It got reprinted in Plasma Blast, and it got reprinted as a secret rare, and I forget what's there. But it doesn't matter. It's been rotated out. Speaking of which, so was Emboar, but Emboar was never really big like Blastoise was. Blastoise, he gone. Blastoise has been rotated. And going along with this, Keldeo has been rotated. Now, Keldeo also was reprinted in Legendary Treasures, but as Legendary Treasures is also being rotated, it's kind of irrelevant. Now, to be fair, Blastoise has not seen much play lately, although there was a chap who made, I think it was top 16 at US Nationals, using Blastoise with Archie's Ace in the Hole to bring it out into the, to kind of bring it out as a basic. So, saw a bit of play. Keldeo is going to be the bigger loss here, because Keldeo essentially was... It was a nice tech Pokemon. It has the Russian ability that allows you to put it in the active. You pop a Floatstone on the Keldeo and you've got a switch every single turn. We're also losing Landorus EX, that big fighting Pokemon. Now, to be perfectly fair, maybe it wasn't going to be good after rotation, but I think this is going to be one of the biggest losses of rotation. You stick a Strong Energy and a Muscle Band on that bad boy, and he's doing 70 damage and 30 to the bench for 1 energy. You stick a Fighting Stadium down and face off against an EX, you're doing 90 damage for 1 energy. That's a 2-hit KO, ladies and gentlemen. We're also losing all of the A-Spec cards. Now, they weren't all printed in Boundaries Crossed. They were printed between Boundaries Crossed and I think Plasma Blast. But the point is, they're all going. We are losing them all. The biggest loss is Computer Search. This was by far the biggest one that we were losing. That was the discard 2 card and search your deck for any card. That was huge. But we're also missing cards like Life Dew, which saw a bit of play. The A-Spec, which essentially stopped the... It stopped your opponent taking a prize, or at least taking 2 prizes off an EX, when they knocked out an EX Pokemon. Similarly, we are losing Scoop Up Cyclone, the Super Scoop Up that doesn't require a coin flip. And we are losing all kinds of, fringe cards that never saw a huge amount of play. Master Ball, for instance, was never going to be that popular, although did see play occasionally. The other big one we're losing, but this really saw a dip in play over the last a couple of years really, was Dowsing Machine, the one where you discarded 2 cards from your hand and picked a trainer out of your discard. We lost it a little while ago, if I'm honest, ladies and gentlemen, because nobody was using it, but we're technically losing it today. And we're losing a couple of fringe cards in Boundaries Crossed. We are losing Dusknoir, which allowed you to switch around the damage counters on your opponent's side of the field. And we're losing Flygon, which put a damage counter on all of your opponent's Pokemon between turns. And there was that short period where Flygon Dusknoir was a deck in itself that played no energy. And actually, I believe if you go back a little way through my YouTube channel, youtube.com/PTCG radio, you will find a video of me and Jay Witz himself playing a mirror match of Dusknoir Flygon, which really is quite funky. In fact, I might see if I can find that and tweet a link out to it at the Wassy, because that's kind of cool. Now, going into Plasma Storm, I think Plasma Storm is the one from which we lose the most. Although, actually, Plasma Freeze is a close second. But let's start with the biggest loss from Plasma Storm. We're losing Mamoswine, people. As of the rotation, as it stands, there is no playable Mamoswine. I've not broken the podcast. I've just a moment, ladies and gentlemen. I'm gutted. Now, don't get me wrong, this Mamoswine sucked. I don't think since I've been playing they've printed an even partially semi-playable Mamoswine. It's not like Donphan where every so often they're like, hey, have a really good Donphan. No, all the Mamoswine cards suck. But that's not the point. We don't have a legal to play Mamoswine anymore. And that is going to hurt. Now, there are some other cards we're losing. We're losing Victini EX, which, although not hugely widely played, was a card where... Where am I going to go with this? I suppose it's a card that people use for energy acceleration occasionally. Wasn't a great card, and it wasn't one which saw a huge amount of play. But every so often, somebody would flick up with a Victini EX card, a Victini EX focused deck, which was kind of cool. So, yeah, not amazing, but a card which saw a bit of play here and there. Now, one kind of card which I don't think all that many people are going to realise we're losing the good Zubat. And I know that might seem a little bit weird, because Zubat's a basic, it sucked. But we're losing the Zubat from Plasma Storm, which has free retreat if there's no energy attached, and it's going to be a dark day that you attach energy to that Zubat. Now we've still got a valid Zubat from Phantom Forces, but it's got a retreat cost of 1, which makes it a bad starter rather than a meh starter. I mean, it had low HP, but you could retreat it straight away. It's a weird little loss. We are losing Donphan. I mean, in the same rotation, in the same set. You know, Plasma Storm gave us Mamoswine and Donphan. What a set, ladies and gentlemen. And we're losing Donphan as well. Now, Donphan, again, he's another card, and this is very recent, really since Roaring Skies. Donphan has started to see a drop in playability. But it's been a valid deck for a while, being able to hit for 40 damage and then add to that with Strong Energy, Muscle Band, Fighting Stadium, etc. And then sticking up something like a Wobbuffet or a Robo Substitute active to take a hit. It's going to be missed. Now, I talked about Blastoise and Keldeo when I talked about Boundaries Crossed, but we're also missing Black Kyurem EX. That's the one that could do, I think 200 damage if you discarded a couple of energy. Now, in the time before we had Mega EXs, that would kill anything. And that was also pre-Wailord. Now, this is another card which it did see a little bit of fringe play. For a time, Blastoise, Keldeo, Black Kyurem was the best deck in the format. This was back when we had Tropical Beach valid, what am I looking for? Legal for tournament play. Whereas it hasn't been for a while, and that really killed. I mean, when we rotated last year and lost Tropical Beach, Blastoise, Keldeo and Black Kyurem all got a lot worse. Although, like I say, Keldeo was still used as a perpetual switch in a whole bunch of decks. But it is sad that we're losing Black Kyurem EX. It was still used with Mega Manectric for a little while. Not often, but people would come and use Mega Manectric, attaching to the benched Black Kyurem using its second attack. It was never a deck that took the world by storm, but a few people had a little bit of success with it. We're losing Cobalion EX, and over the past couple of months, especially since Lissandra's trump card it was banned. Since Lissandra's trump card got banned, we've seen a huge upswing in these metal decks. They've gotten a lot better. Partly because perpetual energy killing with Seismitoad is no longer possible with Lissandra's trump card. Partly because these metal decks rely on having energy in the discard pile, and Lissandra's trump card making you shuffle it all back into your deck was an inconvenience, to say the least. And Cobalion EX was a good little card. No, it wasn't the main card in this deck. We've still got the non-EX Heatran, and we've still got Dialga, and we've still got Edgeslash. There's plenty of attackers to use here. But the point is that this Cobalion was a nice little tech. It went through Safeguard Pokemon, which was handy, and it, for 1 energy, did 30 damage and crucially discarded a special energy. So it was a really nice tech against decks which really relied on the use of special energy. Things like these decks revolving around the Aromatisse that really liked using rainbow energy to tech in other attackers. Or even something like Seismitoad decks. And that's, I suppose it's a loss. It wasn't seeing a huge amount of play, and I'm not sure it was ever going to see a huge amount of play. Now, the other thing, of course, is that we're losing all of the really good safeguard Pokemon. We are losing both Suicune and Sigilif in terms of Pokemon that can use safeguard, although we still do have a Beautifly, which I don't think is going to be particularly good, but it's now the only safeguard Pokemon we've got. Having said that, do you really need a safeguard Pokemon? You know, let's say, for instance, I mean, what I'm saying is, do you really need a Pokemon to go through safeguard if you've got a non-EX Pokemon anyway? Safeguard stops the EX Pokemon hitting you, and Cobalion EX could go through that and one-hit KO both Suicune and Sigilif. But if you're playing a non-EX Heatran anyway, you don't need an EX that can go through it. But it was still a nice little card that saw a fair bunch of play. We're losing all the Plasma stuff. That includes Lugia EX, which was reprinted in Legendary Treasures, but that's rotating, which didn't see a huge amount of play, to be honest with you, but I think underutilized. I did a podcast a couple of months ago on speed decks and how the format has gotten really, really fast lately. And I think Lugia I don't think it's been properly explored as a speed deck. Honestly, I think somebody could take a speed Lugia deck to Worlds and do very, very well with it. Maybe I haven't done a deck breakdown on my YouTube channel for a while. Maybe I'll do a Lugia one. So, we're also losing Snorlax. And Snorlax, he was a decent attacker. I know Tom Hall, he's been mentioned previously this week, he took a Snorlax Eels deck to Worlds, I think 2 years ago, and he said it was the most fun deck he ever played. Snorlax had a decent but hard to use attack. You know, it could do 180 if you had 6 Plasma Pokemon in play for like 1,000,000 energy. But it also had the ability to stop your opponent retreating. And, I mean, as recently as Manchester Regionals this year, my good friend Tommy Roberts used Snorlax in, I think, a Virizion Genesect deck, essentially against a Hawlucha, because Hawlucha can't hit non-EX Pokemon, and people with Hawlucha tend to play less switches because Hawlucha's got free retreat. So Tommy just literally put a Snorlax active against a Hawlucha in 2 games in a row and just let his opponent deck out. I suppose it was kind of Wailord before Wailord, to be honest with you. We're also losing Bicycle, which again is less of a loss since we've got things like Acrobike and Trainer's Mail and Shaman. We're losing Colrus, which was a supporter that did see a whole bunch of play, especially since VX Seeker was released, and we've had things like Battle Compressor. An awful lot of people were just playing one Colrus in their deck so that they could discard it at the earliest opportunity, and then they could VS Seeker for a Juniper, or they could VS Seeker for a Colrus or something like that. That is going to be a loss. We're losing Random Receiver, which was legal due to being reprinted as a secret rare in Plasma Storm. And again, with cards like Trainer's Mail, Acrobike, Shaman, etc., Random Receiver was not such a widely used card, but it gave options. I mean, I've talked quite a bit on this podcast about my Speed Don fan deck, which totally wasn't mine. I nicked the list from my good friend Tommy Roberts. Let's be clear about this. But I literally just played, I think I played 1 Corinna, 1 Lysandra, and then I played 4 Juniper, 4 VS Seeker, 4 Random Receiver, and oh my, that deck was fast. But then again, that was also in the time when we had Lysandra's trump card to put everything back in the deck. I don't know if that'd be so viable now. We're also losing the Tool Drop Trubbish. Now, he was a kind of card that he would come back every so often. He was. There was a time when the Tool Drop Trubbish was really, really good. And that time has passed a little bit now. But with your, essentially Startling Megaphone killed it. It was the one that did 20 damage times all the tools on the field for 2 energy. But with Dimension Valley, you could do it for a single energy. Non-EX Pokemon, single energy. I think it was Charlie Powell in the UK. He won a city championship earlier in the year with this, because unless you come across people who are prepared, it's an incredibly powerful deck. It's another deck that I could see making a cheeky play at Worlds for people who have got a little more brass neck than others, but more of a day 1 deck than a day 2, I would say. By which I mean in day 1, it's essentially there's so many people I might as well try something different. Whereas on day 2, it's a much smaller pool full of much better players. So you really want to focus on, having a really good matchups across the board. So that brings us to the biggest loss from Plasma Storm, and arguably the biggest loss of the rotation. Laserbank. Ladies and gentlemen, he gone. And this is a good thing, a wonderful thing. That trainer card, which not only automatically poisoned you, but had a stadium that made it do 30 damage between turns, not 10, and had a 50-50 chance of putting you to sleep, or a 25% chance of leaving you asleep going into your turn. How many games did we all lose? If you're anything like me, you lost more than you won in this situation. How many games did we all lose because our opponent got lucky on sleep flips? Or if you're a lucky person, how many games did you win because you got lucky on sleep flips? I don't like you. The point is, it's gone, and I think it's a good thing. I didn't like Laser Verbank. I played it because you kind of had to. It's like Shaman or Claydol back in the day. You've got to play it because your opponent gets so much advantage if they're playing it and you don't. I hated Laserbank, and I'm happy it's gone. Yay! I remember there was a time on this podcast when I was essentially trying to figure out what the bigger loss was. What the most annoying thing was, Catcher or Laserbank. And now, with Catcher being put on a coin flip and Laser rotated, it's a moot point. And oh my goodness, ladies and gentlemen, does that make me happy. Going into Plasma Freeze, we're not losing a huge amount of things which saw a huge amount of play here. What we're losing is a whole bunch of cards which might have seen play occasionally or existed as options, I suppose. So let's run through a bunch of these nice and quickly. We are losing Executor, the one with blockade that blocks supporters, which again was good a few months ago, but since we've got things like Shaman and Trainer's Mail, and so few people are relying on supporters like they used to, it had already seen its drop in play to almost zero. We're losing Flareon, but by the time the rotation takes effect, Vesperquen will have been released that has the exact same attack, and there's even a Flareon that you can put on the bench to make Vesperquen a fire type. So we're losing Flareon, but we're not really losing Flareon. We're losing Plasma Kyurem, who again saw a lot more play back when Plasma was big than it has been seeing recently. But people were putting one or two of these into Manectric EX decks, Mega Manectric decks, and it was serving as a really nice, efficient non-EX attacker. We're losing Thunderous and Deoxys. They were really the core of this Plasma deck. But again, the Plasma deck, bless his little cotton socks. Dan Middleton tried to use it at a regionals or as a cities. He tried to play at some tournament in Nottingham, and credit to him, I think he actually made top 4 with it. He's a very good player, but it really is kind of, the time has passed now, I think it's fair to say. One of the two biggest losses from Frozen City, no, I'm reading ahead here, from Plasma Freeze, we're losing Mr. Mime. And Mr. Mime has been seeing a huge amount of play. Now, having said that, one of the most annoying things for hitting the bench was Landorus EX, and we're losing Landorus EX. But even so, that's a heck of a loss, ladies and gentlemen. Now, there are other options for protecting your bench, and we'll go through them in the future. My point is, if there were other options that were better than Mr. Mime for protecting your bench, people would be playing them instead of Mr. Mime. The fact that Mr. Mime was still seeing so much play, and it was seeing play in a huge amount of decks, I think proves how good it was. Now, we have got Mountain Ring, and, that does prevent bench damage, but it also prevents bench damage to your opponent's bench, done by you, and it's a stadium, and most decks nowadays have a stadium they want to play. So make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mime was still played a lot and played for a reason. Now, the other cards we're using weren't seeing a huge amount of play. Some of them were, I suppose. We're losing the Weavile that allowed you to discard a whole heap of cards from your hand and then do 30 damage times the amount you discarded. It had a little niche of being good last year, but it hasn't been good since. I think Tommy Roberts, my good friend Tommy Roberts, Did all right at the ECC with it last year, although I think he miscut. We're missing the Absol that did a bunch of bench damage for how many dark Pokemon you had on the bench. Again, not a hugely played Pokemon, but one which would occasionally be teched into good use. When losing Frozen City, the stadium that put 2 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon for every energy you attach. However, when was the last time we saw someone playing Frozen City? Now, this is actually a bit of a loss, because we are getting we're getting some new cards. Oh, no, not getting. We've had some new cards, I should say. We've got the Shedinja, which does 50 damage times the amount of damage counters on it. And Frozen City was the easiest way to damage yourself, to do a whole bunch of damage. And we're now losing that, which is a shame. I'll give you that. It is a shame. But then again, we've had Shedinja and all the support cards we want for a lot of tournaments now, a whole bunch of tournaments, and hands up if you played against a Shedinja deck at Nationals. I don't think many of you did. Speaking of which, and this is something I left off my list and I've only just realized. No, I'm lying to you. Does anyone else get confused between the set symbol for X and Y and Plasma Blast, or is it just me? I really do. I was actually considering turning this, just literally cutting the audio of this and making it into a YouTube video, but I think on my podcast I'm a little bit too casual for YouTube. I think a lot of random people would watch the video and go, "What's up with this dude? Why is he being kind of casual and going off on tangents?" I've had a lot of good comments, good feedback on the podcast, but I think people who just watch the YouTube channel, I think I might have to make my own series of videos. Speaking of which, is that a video? And again, hit me up on Twitter at @TheWassy or email me at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk. Would anyone be interested in those videos? What I'm thinking is a little series of videos, doing one would be too long, where I actually look set by set, in depth at the rotation. I.e., all the cards, good and fringe, that we're losing from Boundaries Crossed, all the cards we're losing from Plasma Storm, etc. Giving you a really good, in-depth rundown, even more in-depth than I'm doing today. If that's a series of videos you'd like me to do on PTCG Radio, the YouTube channel, do let me know, people. Hit me up. So, the other things we're losing from Plasma Freeze, let's run through the last few of these. Getsis, the supporter, which made your opponent shuffle all their item cards in their hand back into their deck, saw a tiny bit of play in Trainer Lock decks, not very much. Superior Energy Retrieval, another card that was absolutely crucial for the Blastoise decks, but really hasn't been seeing a huge amount of play since. And the last two, Empoleon, which has been seeing play. This is the card which has most often been used with Archie's Ace in the Hole. That's a supporter card which allows you to put a water Pokemon on your bench as if it were a basic, and then draw 5 cards, as long as it's the only card in your hand when you play it. And people would use this in things like Night March to put an Empoleon down as a backup attacker, but also to use its diving draw ability. And finally, and I know I said this about Mr. Mime, but I think this could also be the biggest loss from Plasma Freeze. Max Potion. That's going to be a big loss, and I've double-checked. I'm 99% sure it hasn't been reprinted. We're losing Max Potion, people. That's going to be a big loss. Now, going into Plasma Blast, honestly, it's not as big a set as Storm or Freeze in terms of what's being rotated. There's the Masquerain that's got the ability which allows you to switch around tools attached to your Pokemon. There's... this one's heartbreaking to me. We're losing the Cradley, which allows you to put 2 Stage 2s on your bench as if they were basic Pokemon. But Cradley was going to get so much better with Giant Plant Forest, because you could, if everything went well, you could get him out on turn 1, and the attack was for 1 energy, so you could potentially on turn 1 get a Cradley out, and then, because you get a Lillipat in the usual way, and then evolve it using Giant Plant Forest into Cradley, and then you get 2 Stage 2s on your bench. And now we can't do that anymore, because Cradley's being rotated right as Giant Plant Forest is coming out. Now, we always knew that they were never going to keep Plasma Blast in the format this year. But does anyone else think that's a real kicker? We're losing both Virizion and Genesect. That deck, again, I mean, as recently as Worlds last year, it was hands down best deck in the format. It's not been great. Nobody's playing it anymore, unfortunately. It's too slow nowadays. You don't get the 2 attachments onto Virizion like you used to be able to. It dies to decks like Rayquaza and Night March incredibly quickly. Virizion was, however, used in decks like Rayquaza, decks where you could afford to play any basic energy you liked. People in decks like Rayquaza would play Grass Energy so that they could take advantage of Virizion's ability and leave their Pokemon immune to special conditions. Genesect was also occasionally used in like Evolution decks for its Red Signal ability, using it instead of Lysandre or Pokemon Catcher. But both of those cards had seen better days. We are losing the Drifblim, which abused Plasma Pokemon, but as we're losing all the Plasma Pokemon, I don't think that's the worst thing ever. We're losing Silver Bangle. Now, Silver Bangle is just like Muscle Band, except it does 30 damage instead of 20, can only be attached to a non-EX, and only does extra damage to an EX. And we still got Muscle Band. It's not a huge loss, but for people focusing on non-EX decks, they usually played 1 or 2 of these. We're losing Safeguard Suicune, like I mentioned before. And we're losing Execute. And Execute is another one of those, because he was released in Plasma Freeze, but he was a secret rare in Plasma Blast. And Execute was another one of those, I suppose I'm going to call it the sneaky valuable Pokemon. People were playing 1 or 2 of these in a lot of decks just to make the discard from Ultra Ball less harsh. And now it's gone. Or at least it will be gone when we rotate. It's a card that I think a lot of people are going to miss. And then finishing off with Legendary Treasures, we are losing Mewtwo EX. Now, I remember the first ECC I went to back in 2012. And this was, I think, like 10 days after Mewtwo was released. And I remember, and I've told this story on the podcast many a time, so I apologise if it's a little bit old hat by now. But I managed to get 33rd and Bubble, and oh my goodness, that was a painful Bubble. Bubble top cut of the ECC, it was a top 32 cut that year. And I won a load of games just by basically saying, ha, I've got more Mewtwo's than you. Which was kind of unfair and kind of hilarious. And it's weird to me that we're, well over 2 years later. 3 years later, sorry, well over 3 years later. And Mewtwo's still in the format. Of course, as soon as it rotates, we've got Lugia, who, it's essentially the same card, but it's not as good as Mewtwo. It's got the same kind of attack, but it's got a much worse weakness in Lightning, and things like Raichu running around next format are going to abuse this. But also, Mewtwo, as well as having a better weakness now, has got a better typing. There's a whole bunch of little Pokemon which are weak to Psychic, and nothing's weak to Colourless. Not since, I think, if I remember correctly, the Colourless Wars back in the SP era with Garchomp and Dragonite and Ambipom and all of that, I think they were the last cards, at least the last cards that were widely played, that were weak to Colourless. Please, if I'm wrong about that, ladies and gentlemen, please do correct me. But I don't think anything's weak to Colourless in the current format, whereas things are weak to Psychic. So Mewtwo's still better than Lugia. But the other thing is, how many people are playing Mewtwo nowadays? Now, to be fair, the answer is a few. In decks like Fairy decks or Metal decks, decks that rely on getting and keeping a whole bunch of energy on the field, people will play one Mewtwo as a sweeper just to chuck it out and smash at the end of the game. You can still use Lugia for that. But I've made this point on the podcast before. Lugia really isn't going to see a huge amount of play, not like people think it is. Plus, Rayquaza's just better. Takes less effort to KO anything. It's got the same weakness. And it takes less effort to KO a whole bunch of stuff. I believe that's my list from Plasma Blast. So going into Legendary Treasures. No, we already went into Legendary Treasures. One more reason why I'm not just going to cut this audio and put it up as a YouTube video. We're losing Sigilyph. As I said, both the main Safeguard Pokemon are gone, although we are getting a Beautifly. We're losing Terrakion, another card which I cannot believe is still in the format. This astounds me. When I grinded into Worlds back in 2012, Terrakion was a huge part of my CMT deck. It was released in Noble Victories, for goodness sake. It's still going. But it is now finally being rotated out. Nobody really plays it anymore. But, I mean, from a nostalgic point of view, that card has been good to me. I've played it in an awful lot of decks. We're losing the Spiritomb that's got the abilities that stops you playing ace specs, but we're also losing all the ace specs, so that's not a big deal. We're finally losing Darkrai, another Pokemon that seems to have been around forever, and again has gone from being, a couple of years ago, completely taking over Worlds, to, the year I went in 2012, it really was everywhere, which is why my CMT deck was so much fun, because it destroyed Darkrai. And it has become a fringe deck. In decks that play, in dark decks, all these rainbow decks, like your Aromatisse decks, people have played it to use its ability as a free retreat, but that really is it. We are losing Mew-EX, which still somehow seeing play in decks like Night March, so that is going to be missed. And finally, one that I almost left off my list, and again I think it's a card a lot of people are going to forget when they look at the rotation, Fliptini. The Victini with the ability that allows you to reflip coins as part of the attack, so that you can, essentially have a mulligan. Now, as somebody pointed out, I think Lauren Miller, a podcast listener, confirmed man, Lauren Miller, pointed out by email to me a couple of weeks ago, pointed out that we've got Trick Coin, which does the same thing, but it's a Pokemon tool, which means you can't use it under Trainer Lock, which means that your opponent can play Startling Megaphone to get rid of it, and which means that you can't also use something like Muscle Band or Floatstone at the same time. And that, I believe, is the main cards we're losing for rotation. Now, just to reiterate, this was a very last-minute change of plan. I like to keep you guys up to date, and the news came out on Wednesday afternoon, right as I was sitting down. Literally, I think 15 minutes before I started recording, or planned to start recording, I flicked up the news, so I always check if there's any last-minute news, to find out that the rotation has been confirmed. So, if I've said a card which has been reprinted and I've missed it, let me know, at the Wassy. Or if I have forgotten a card that you think is relevant, it might be a deliberate omission, just to be clear. Or I might have actually missed it, so hit me up on Twitter. And I am considering doing a little series of videos, one per set, basically looking at what we lose in the rotation, in a little bit more detail, with a little bit more explanation, and glorious colour pictures. If that's a series that you'd like to do, hit me up on Twitter, email, I've said it many times already. So hit me up and I'll see if I can get round to some of them end of this week, beginning of next week. For now, ladies and gentlemen, we are 53 minutes in, and I think that will just about do it this week. And I'm afraid Giant Plant Forest is going to have to wait another week. Hopefully next week I will finally get around to Giant Plant Forest, but I can't promise that that's going to happen. And if you are listening to this podcast for the first time because you want to find out about the rotation, hello. It's been nice to meet you. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. I hope you become a regular listener. Go and subscribe. It's on SoundCloud, it's on iTunes, and it goes on YouTube every week as well. It ain't hard to find, ladies and gentlemen. One day it might even be on Stitcher. But I think that'll do for now. Hit me up on your opinions about the rotation. And remember, if you only take away one thing from this week's podcast, do not use the delivery service Yodel. They are garbage. Look after yourselves till next week. My name's Ross, and you've been listening to PTCG Radio.